Hey, folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board. It's been a while. I've been on vacation and now I'm back, and I have some things to talk about. Did some thinking while I was traveling. I had a lot of time on the plane, and want to talk a little bit about obstacles to creativity. Not personal obstacles, not the kind that contributes to writer's block or a lack of inspiration or anything like that. I think if you're really creative, you probably never struggle with those problems. To be perfectly honest, I never have. A lot of the really good writers and artists I know, they don't really talk about it a whole lot. Rather, these are the kind of obstacles that you face from other people. As you probably guessed by the title of this video, the first one I want to talk about is fear. And fear is an obstacle to creativity in a lot of different ways. But the way I really want to talk about is fear of the consequences of your art or your expression. Your story or your art, your drawings, things like that. And we if you've followed the history of comics or video games or movies, you know what I'm talking about. This typically comes up in relation to violence. There was the violent video game scare in the 90s. Of course, there was worries about violence in comic books to the point where the Comics Code Authority came into being. I'm not a real expert on that. Other people have explored that history in particular in other places, and likewise for the history of violent video games. And I believe it was Jack Thompson who was the politician who was up in arms about it. But long story short, fear is a very common reaction to media, um, and there are a lot of reasons for that. The purpose of fear in the human mind is interesting. I knew a guy who thought about. They say your emotions aren't real, and I knew a guy who always said emotions are real, um, but they're real personally, and I never quite understood what he meant by that until I stopped thinking of emotions as a thing, and I started thinking about them as a sense. Kind of like you have your five senses to tell you about the world around you. Your feelings tell you about the world in your mind. Specifically, I think they're a window into your subconscious. And fear is the sense that tells you your subconscious is seeing thinks you're in danger. And when you think about it that way, it's why people react to media with fear is it kind of makes a little bit of sense. The whole point of media is to, um, especially a storytelling media like comics, like movies, even to an extent like video games, is to create feelings that don't correspond to reality. That's the whole point. You're trying to a certain extent, create that danger response. You're trying to create, happiness or sadness. A feeling of achievement that isn't necessarily real. And of course, when you are dealing with, let's take video games as an example. When you're dealing with video games, people frequently talk about the good outcomes that you can develop from video games. Things like discipline, problem solving skills, um, strategizing, making plans, overcoming obstacles, things like that. And they say these are positive things, and it, that's I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. And it's not surprising then that people would be scared that the reverse could also be true, that you could be learning uh, um, methods of violence and those kinds of thought patterns. I don't think the evidence bears that out, but I understand, why people think that. And their subconscious is telling them there could be a danger here, and to be cautious. So I understand where this fear response to art and to media can come from. I rarely think it's legitimate, but I understand it. That's what I'm trying to say. I understand why people would have that response, and I think that as you face opposition to your art or to your media, to your stories, to your drawings, to whatever, your fear is probably going to be one of the most common negative reactions. Not the most common. Well, I don't know. It depends. Because I think the other major negative reaction is disgust. And right now, I think in the environment we're in, disgust is actually more likely than fear. But at other times, like in the 90s, I think fear was the more common reaction. And since, the 90s were my formative years, so I think my default is to, take that as more common. But right now, I believe actually disgust is more common. I'm going to talk about that in another video. So right now, let's focus on fear. Why are people afraid of media or afraid of art? Well, again, one of the major points of a work of fiction or a piece of media is to create emotional responses, and you try as you might, getting the response you want is a crapshoot. You can never predict exactly how people will respond to your work, to your media, because people have different life experiences. They look at things differently. That's just part of the joys of trying to create something. There is a lot of uncertainty in the process, unfortunately, or fortunately. Maybe you enjoy that aspect of the creative process, seeing how people will react to it, being surprised by what they take away from it. That's a very valid part of it. But it's not necessarily one that your general audience is going to understand. Highly creative people have very different personalities from the general public, from people who are not high in openness to new experiences. If you go by the big five, like Dr. Peterson does, they may not understand that priority. But anyways, where was I? Oh yes, people have different responses. So maybe you go to provoke one set of emotions. You go to provoke inspiration or determination, or a feeling of resolve or something like that, and it just misfires for some people, and they're going to be scared. Maybe it's because you're dealing with topics that some part of your audience didn't understand, didn't fully grasp. That may be just because they weren't paying attention, or you may have done a bad job of presenting the materials you intended to cover. Regardless, when confronted with the unknown, well, the unknown is dangerous. Fear is not an entirely misplaced response to the unknown. So maybe that shouldn't surprise you, that people react with fear to your media. And you may just be presenting something that people are deeply uncomfortable with. This was, I think, part of the underlying source of the reaction to the anime Goblin Slayer. If you're not familiar with the Goblin Slayer controversy, there were a lot of people who were very upset because the first episode of Goblin Slayer depicted in a not very explicit but not very ambiguous fashion, they depicted a rape, and his video is now demonetized. Anyways, and there are a lot of people who are upset with that for a lot of different reasons. And I think it was a mix of a fear response and a disgust response. And for the people who did have fear responses, I think some of that is probably based in, unfortunately, personal experience. And you know, I have a certain compassion or a certain amount of understanding for people who respond to media with a certain amount of fear. Again, you know, I don't think that fear is always justified, but um, I think that the best thing you can do when people respond to your media with fear is to try and be compassionate and try and be understanding. Um, it's going to be common. It's odds are good that it's not your fault. It could be. You could have made a mistake in, trying to present the ideas that the themes that frightened your audience. But a lot of the times, there is a unspoken, unwritten contract between artist and audience that really should carry a certain amount of forgiveness or understanding for your poor expression. And a, a I don't want to say a good audience, but um, a criticism that does not have that leniency built into it um, should not weigh on you as heavily as criticism that does. And I think a lot of the fear responses that we've seen in the past, the panic about violent video games or violent comics or violent movies, I think those frequently came without that goodwill built into them. And you will undoubtedly face similar criticism in the future. So try and be understanding, try and be compassionate. But I, at the same time, I don't think criticism that asks you to change the nature of your media because of fear is legitimate ever. I don't think it is ever something to take into account. While I was on vacation, I had the opportunity to visit a number of fascinating historical and archaeological sites. And in a couple of these places, in order to see everything there was to see, it was necessary to climb down very long sets of stairs. And I have a fear of heights. It's not a terrible fear of heights. I don't get paralyzed. I don't suffer vertigo. But I find being around heights extremely uncomfortable. But it was more important to me to see all there was to see, to go, to the fullest extent of my ability, is to see and to explore and to understand the things that were in these historical sites. And I wasn't about to let being scared of heights prevent me from doing that. So I climbed all those stairs. In one places, there were 328 of them, up and down, because we had to come back the same way. But I climbed all those stairs, and I saw what there was to see, and I didn't let the fear I felt control me. It was an irrational fear. It was, and I knew that, even though knowing that didn't stop me from feeling it. That part of my hindbrain, the subconscious, that looks for danger, when it looks down, it just screams at me. But I couldn't let that control me. And it's the same when people respond to your creations with fear. Um, there's probably legitimate reasons, at least in their own mind, to do that. But if you believe strongly enough in your own story to really value it, to put in all that work, to tell that story, to climb those stairs, it is far more important that you get there and see what there is to be seen, than it is to be controlled by fear. Most worthwhile things come with a certain amount of danger. And ultimately, you are the one shouldering that danger. Media does not influence people to that extent. That is an excuse. Violent media does not make people violent, although violent people may take it as an excuse to be violent. And people who have suffered a trauma, who see it revived in your work, they are that is unfortunate. That is sad, but that is the reality of the world we live in. And people who hope to accomplish something great, or at least something beneficial to the people around them. And entertainment is beneficial. Don't let people ever tell you that you're just drawing silly pictures, and that you're not trying to present value. You are. And it is worth taking the risks to do that. And if other people don't find those risks worthwhile, they do not have to participate. So if you are getting pushback because people are frightened of your work, just keep in mind they're probably not in control of that fear response, and it's unfortunate that it is controlling them to that degree. But that probably just indicates that they don't value the kind of story you're trying to tell as much as you do. And ultimately, you are the one who has to put the value on your work. You are the one who has to pick the goal you're going for and shoot for that. And you can't let them define your goals for you. If you do, you're going to be stifled at every turn. So ultimately, I don't think a fear-based criticism of your work is ever valid. And I don't think anyone who wants to create can create when they allow fear-based responses to dictate what they will create. This is a bit like, well, no, I'm going to save that analogy for my next video. Anyways, just some thoughts, because no one likes to see people scared. Most people don't like to scare people, unless, of course, it's something like a horror story where everyone has already agreed to be scared ahead of time. As odd as it may be to think about it that way. So there I don't know, this may just be me, but for me there is a desire to create things that everyone will be okay with. And knowing that, I know that telling stories, and especially as comics tend to, stories with a fair bit of violence in them, that's going to scare some people, and they're not going to like that. But ultimately, and I don't want to scare people with my stories. I think that the violence in them is a necessary part of making a story that shows the inspiring nature of struggling and overcoming. And I want that to be the kind of story that spurs people to good things, not to bad things, that inspires them to fulfill their ambitions, not scares them away from fulfilling them. However, ultimately, in order to do that, I have to run the risk that some people might be frightened that way. That doesn't make me happy. I don't enjoy that thought, but I'm not going to let it stop me. And if anyone, criticizes me because, they say you're encouraging violence or something like that, that is a criticism that I am just going to ignore. I cannot allow it to dictate the stories I tell or what I try and create, and I don't think anyone else should either. So that's really all I have to say today. Pretty rambly, more rambly than I thought it was going to be when I started. Because really, at the heart of it, it's a pretty simple message. People are going to there are people who will be frightened of pretty much any topic you choose to tackle. Their fears, may come from good places. Probably do. You should be respectful and compassionate of it, but you shouldn't yield to them. You shouldn't be controlled by it. And that's all I have to say. So I hope you found that interesting or enjoyable. There's a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.